tonight's presentation, I've got an awful lot of material here, probably too much to get through for the whole evening. Right, just get onto the right. Yeah, that one there. Okay. Really just to talk about my national roles, which Caroline alluded to. And I suppose I've been someone that's always been keen to sort of put my head above the parapet and speak out. And as a consequence, I've taken on quite a lot of national roles. And I'll talk a bit about what that actually means in practice. But also talk a bit about my day job, the current sort of financial situation that we're facing within local government. But more importantly, I guess for you, is the links with my work in health, and also talking a bit about how Leicestershire's approaching the new agenda in health with government. And we are already sort of progressing some of our thinking about some of the new structures around health. And then, more importantly, I guess, what I've sort of been asked to talk about is the low carbon society, and particularly a project which my professional network, ADEPT, did in looking at scenarios in terms of future planning, and some interesting considerations for you to sort of think about. And also, finally, if I do have time, to talk about how Leicestershire, my own authority, is approaching tackling climate change. So the quiz. I suppose one of the sad things I do when I go on holiday is take pictures of transport and roads and other things that I'm interested in. So what I've got for you tonight is a series of pictures that I've taken in all parts of the world. And as it says on the sheet, the quiz is about you identifying the location and the country of this particular form of, as I say, sustainable transport. Maybe some of them are not quite as sustainable as they ought to be. So that's your first quiz question. Where is that slide taken? Which is the city and which is the country? And I'm not going to keep them up for too long, otherwise they'll detract from the presentation. So that's the end of it, I'm afraid. Okay, what is ADEPT? Well, ADEPT is an acronym for the Association of Directors of Environment, Economy, Planning and Transport. And actually we come from quite a history, because prior to this we were the County Surveyor Society. And up till about sort of 5 or 10 years ago, there weren't any more county surveyors. So having a title of county surveyors wasn't really appropriate in the modern era. But it's people like myself who have responsibility for those areas of business. And it's a network organisation, as says on the slide. And we very much give a lot of advice to government. I was in London last week, where we met with Director Generals from 3 government departments, Department of Transport, DEFRA, and BIS. So we have quite a lot of influence in speaking on behalf of the sector and trying to influence. And that's really important in the new coalition government, because I won't get political, but I think quite a lot of the things that they're progressing haven't been well thought through. So they do need people like us to help give them advice about how they can progress some of the things that they want to do on a long-term basis. And that's the structure. We have a president's team, various working groups and committees. This is a national organisation, and I'm very proud to be the current vice president. So I take over in June, and I'll have a chain around my neck like Caroline, and be invited to 1 or 2 dinners, but more importantly to lead the organisation and take it forward in a very challenging time, I guess. Right, your next transport question. And I'm not going to keep that up there very long. And there is a prize at the end of this, by the way, so there's a bottle of bubbly for somebody who gets the most right answers. The UK Roads Board, this was very much established as a consequence of devolution, where government realised by fragmenting various Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, they wanted an organisation that would bring those countries together to engage with and give advice on highways policies. So this was set up not very long ago, and I've had the honour of chairing one of the 4 boards, the UK Roads Board. And as Caroline said, as a consequence of that, I've been given a lot of advice to government over the last 3 winters. So I was very much involved in when the country was running out of salt, not just this year, but in previous years as well, and looking about how we provide imports and tackle a very sort of challenging situation. I was involved in writing reports and giving evidence to parliamentary select committees. The other thing that the UK Roads Board do importantly is obviously promote and promulgate best practice. So what we do as an organisation is produce these sort of documents to give advice to our sector based on best practice evidence, and this is very useful for highway authorities in trying to provide better consistency and management of their road networks. And I've just been involved in developing a 4th code of practice around traffic management systems, which is about to be published. Right, your 3rd picture. I'm not sure a diesel train is sustainable, actually, so this may not be quite appropriate, but I did quite like the picture. Okay, Leicestershire County Council. I'm very proud of Leicestershire. Apologies for those of you in Nottinghamshire, but we were Council of the Year in 2009, and for those of you perhaps know, my lead member, Mrs Pendleton, who's a local councillor in your neck of the woods, Caroline, when your practice is, she was very pleased to come along to London with us and pick up this very prestigious award. So we do things very well in Leicestershire, but I suppose you'd expect me to say that, but that's based on clear evidence of our performance. And this is our management structure, so I'm one of 4 of a corporate management team reporting to the Chief Executive. And within my own structure, I have 3 assistant directors and then 2 business advisors on HR and finance. And the 3 key business areas around transportation, highways and waste management and environment. So that's my sort of key team. And in terms of our current challenges, clearly the spending review was quite challenging to local government, but clearly it was necessary to cut public expenditure to address the deficit. So in Leicestershire, our grant was reduced by 27%, so that's more than a quarter of our overall revenue budget. And that meant that we were going to have to make savings of £80 million over 4 years. Part of the challenge in that was that it was front-loaded, so it wasn't an even proportion of savings over the 4 years. This year in particular, we're having to make between 11 and 12% of those cuts. And my capital funding, that's for new infrastructure, has been cut by 17%. Plus, we've lost a lot of specific grants. So, very challenging times in local government. But what we were trying to do to avoid service cuts is drive through efficiencies in our business. So we're looking to deliver half of those cuts by efficiencies, and this is by looking at cutting out wastage, looking at outsourcing, shared service with other organisations, developing techniques that have come from the private sector in terms of lean management. And I'm very confident, certainly in my area of business, that we'll achieve half of the budget reductions by efficiencies, but inevitably there will be service cuts. And what we're trying to do is make sure that we protect things that protect the integrity of the road network, and maybe look at reducing some of the budgets and some of the things that are perhaps less important, like grass cutting, for example. My overall budget, as Caroline says, is over 100 million, and that's how it's split between the various parts of my business. And my departmental figure, the figure I was talking to you about was corporate, is 23%, because of the mix of revenue and capital. Okay, another picture on sustainable transport. And actually Caroline features in this one, and this is quite a hard one actually, because in theory it could be anywhere in the world, but if you look very carefully on that board in the background, it does look a bit Italian, so there's a bit of a clue for you. One thing that is very relevant, I think, in relation to my work and health, is our 3rd local transport plan that was only published very recently, approved by my own county council in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And this is our strategic document that sets out our approach to transport over the next 15 years. And that's really important, because with transport you have to take a long-term perspective in terms of what you want to deliver in terms of infrastructure and how you want to change culture and habits. So in terms of the relationship between the local transport plan and health, there is lots of areas that we are hoping to progress that really support the health agenda. And a lot of it is around changing people's habit, the way they travel, and supporting cycling, walking, and addressing things like obesity, for example. But also in trying to reduce congestion on our roads because of the pollution, the fumes from cars, which again in itself causes health hazards. If we can reduce congestion, then hopefully we can avoid some of the worst consequences around that. But also around quality for life, in terms of my responsibilities around environment, and encourage people to use our rights of ways and our green spaces. And again, that clearly will help people's well-being and aid mental health and physical health. And in how we actually go about that, then clearly what we're trying to do is promote a lot of the infrastructure that's available to the public to use. But nobody will want to walk or cycle if we don't provide safe facilities for people to travel. So, one of the things we're trying to do is improve the infrastructure to help support people who would like to make those choices. But also working with businesses, hospitals, schools, to develop travel plans where we can sit down with those organisations and say, well, what are the barriers to your employees, your school children, avoiding having to come in a car? Is it because there's concern from the public about a safe route? Do you need a pelican crossing? Is it that we need somebody to help your children walk to school? So all those things we're trying to do to help promote more sustainable ways of people travelling. And some of it is about not just people using bikes and things, but providing safe, secure facilities for people to keep their bicycles in. And in terms of new infrastructure, we have a big influence. I was saying earlier, talking to one or two people in Leicestershire, there are currently plans for 20,000 new homes across the county. So it's very important that when we deliver or support the delivery of those new homes, that they're built in a sustainable way. And what we want to do from the start of those developments is avoid people having to travel in the first place. So the concept really is to try and promote these developments where there's employment and we avoid people doing long commuting. But where people do have to travel, it's trying to promote and make sure we put public transport infrastructure in from day one, so people have that facility and it's available rather than immediately using their car and then getting into a habit of doing so. Road safety is clearly an important part of my job, and we had another fatality on the M6 at Capthorpe yesterday, which was very disappointing because there is a scheme that will avoid some of the problems around that bit of infrastructure. But we continue to have deaths on our roads, too many, but we are working hard to improve that situation, and we have been successful. And that's around a number of ways, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, or whether it's enforcement. And for those of you that think that we put speed cameras up to make money, far from it in Leicestershire. Every camera is there for a reason, that has been a speed-related accident, and we have clear evidence that those cameras have saved lives. So they're there for a very good reason, and it would be a retrograde step to move them. So, we're continuing to look at the data we have in terms of how we target our funding. And in developing our LTP 3, we need to look at the future demographics, the impact around the changes we have in our adult social care service, where there's going to be more personalised budgets, and how people will take up service. And clearly, we have an ageing population that has a real impact on how people move around and the infrastructure they require. And we need to understand that the NHS changes and how they would impact on the transport infrastructure. So we're very keen to work with people like you to understand, what your views are and how we can shape the future in transport terms. Another one. It does look a bit like the Nottingham tram, this, but I don't think you'll recognise the rest of the scene in Nottingham. So where are we with the new agenda in Leicestershire? Well, we are quite ahead of the game, actually. We're already setting up what we call a Health and Wellbeing Board for Leicestershire, and this will be a shadow board in place, ready for the legislation to come in place. And this is very much around integrating NHS, social care, public health, and other local services. So what we have already is the Director of Public Health is on our management team, although I didn't show that on that structure, that is an old one. So that just shows how prominent health is being integrated into our business. The Director of Public Health staff have all moved into our county hall. So these changes are already taking place. And who are we having on the shadow board? Well, it's quite interesting, all the politics that are going on at the moment about what's appropriate, but this is clearly bringing all the key people together who have an influence in shaping and dealing with health within Leicestershire. So that's the structure that we're looking at, and I'd be interested to hear the discussion that was going on today about how Nottinghamshire are approaching how they take that forward. And this is part of a wider ethos that we're promoting, but also with government, about having much more joined up public services, not just in health, but in other areas of service. And there's an initiative called community-based budgeting, where rather than individual organisations work in their silos, we actually pull the budgets together from those organisations and use it to much better effect in a more proactive way. And I won't go into detail around these slides, but we're seriously looking at the whole shape about how we deliver services, sort of in a cradle-to-grave situation, and how, rather than dealing with the consequences, we can start tackling the causes to avoid the problems and the high cost of those consequences in the longer term. So again, this is just one area of health that we've been looking at in that sort of new approach in terms of tackling obesity and heavy weight, and how all the organisations that have an interest in this, all the public organisations, rather than working in isolation, can join up, pool their budgets, and we target it in the most way that can have the most impact in avoiding the problem. Okay, this is an interesting picture of a vernacular railway. Okay, enough about Leicestershire and health. Let's talk about the low carbon society. As I said, what I'm going to talk to you about is a project that ADEPT funded. We work with an organisation called Forum for the Future. I don't know if some of you might have heard of somebody called Jonathan Porritt, who has been a leading environmentalist for a while, and a really interesting person to work with. And it's his organisation that helped us look at these scenarios. And this is quite a stark slide to consider. And I think the question is whether you agree or not with the causes of global warming. I think the evidence is indisputable that our climate is changing, and there's clear evidence of average increases in mean temperature. And if we continue to do nothing, then we'll have to face the consequences. So globally, there is a target to reduce carbon emissions by 80%. The UK government have set a target for local authorities to have a 30% reduction by 2015. And these are very challenging figures, but nevertheless, it's really something that we've got to try and consider. Otherwise, we will be facing some of the worst consequences. And I guess when I start talking about the consequences, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So the aim of this particular project was to look at various scenarios of what a low-carbon society might look like in the future, and what influences went to progress that particular scenario, but also as a consequence of this work to think about what we could do to make a difference in going forward to avoid some of these consequences. And the scenario planning is looking at 2030. Now, some of you may feel, well, why should we worry about that sort of timescale? But certainly, hopefully, many of us will still be around, and our children will be. And this is the future we're talking about. So it's no good us just thinking, well, it won't affect us. Why should we bother? It's really important that we do take action ourselves. As I said, this was an organisation called Forum for the Future have helped us develop it. The original study was done with Hewlett-Packard, so this is something that has been developed with other organisations. And in terms of the future we know, then there is already energy concerns about energy security. We can see some of the issues what are happening in North Africa and the Middle East, and the other issue that we're well aware of is that demand is increasing. So there are consequences there. Also in water, UK water supplies are already under stress with increased population and demand. And another consequence of problems with water is that we're paving over more and more of our land area, which is increasing our flood risk. Population increase, by 2030 there will be at least another 1 billion people on this planet. I mean, just the numbers are just really worrying, and UK population is expected to exceed 70 million. And obviously, the growth will be fueled further by increased life expectancy, and high levels of migration will increase demand on resources. And we'll continue to see the consequences of climate change. So again, I suppose my experience for the last 10 years working in local government that every year we've had a severe weather event, where the previous 20, we hardly had them. So we're seeing increased frequencies of intense storms. We're seeing more areas affected by drought, hotter, warmer heat waves, and sea levels are rising. And what is the future? We don't know. And again, these will sort of be explored around the scenarios. But what sort of energy infrastructure is going to be appropriate for the future? Clearly, there's questions now about nuclear power, and in the light of what's happened in Japan. What is our response going to be to climate change? We are already looking at adaptation and mitigation, but how far are we going to go with that? And again, we heard news about the problems in Portugal. There is continual financial turbulence in the world markets. And then, what are the technological developments? Just think about some of the new technology we've had recently. The impact of mobile phones on how we live our lives. Who would have thought 20 years ago that all of us have been carrying this device that we sort of hold onto our ear all the time to speak and to communicate. So, those sort of things we don't know. And also, social response. The government are promoting a new concept around big society. Is that going to be taken forward? Is it going to be supported? So all these things are considerations for the future. We have another picture. Okay, so the first scenario is around what I'm calling community action, and this is looking. So this is where you've got to project yourself forward to 2030 and think about how society will be then. And what this scenario says, after a long depression, has pushed up the price of oil. They forced governments to improve energy efficiency and bring down carbon emissions. New forms of living, and that there will be a well-being economy that values meaningful work, low-impact lifestyles, more time with families, better health outcomes. I mean, this sounds quite a good scenario in some respects. Create education experiences and a stronger sense of community. The state is small and localised. Public services are delivered by and for the community. So this is maybe sort of embracing the big society concept. And people routinely volunteer for up to 10 hours per week in exchange for community credits. The focus is on community and has led some young people to rebel, and gang culture is a problem. So how do we get there? So what I want to now do is describe the stages that went through in terms of how this society was progressed. So in the first 10 years, this is 2010 to 20, so in the next 10 years, the scenario is economic recession entrenches across the world as oil and commodity prices rocket, as I've said. This leads to worldwide mass unemployment, and harrowing evidence of malnutrition in developed countries appears on the screens across the world. Unemployment in the UK leads to resentment, unhappiness, and intergenerational violence is on the increase as young people blame the older generations for the economic and environmental crisis. So that goes right back to what I said. We should have acted earlier, and obviously in this scenario, the view is that action wasn't taken early enough. Suicide and depression rates rocket. To reduce idleness, clubs that share skills in DIY, cooking and gardening are established in the major towns and cities. Local authorities develop city and county currencies to encourage young people to buy local. So again, some of that sort of concept of people buying local produce is developing. Car use declines as petrol prices increase. Well, we're already seeing some of that right now. Planning rules are relaxed as the need for local energy generation increases, and small-scale wind turbines and solar panels appear on roofs across the country. So there you go, Caroline. Economic growth becomes just one of many indicators of a healthy economy, and the indicators of happiness and well-being appear in national and local policies. So that's the first 10 years. Now, if we sort of project ourselves, we almost want to be in a time machine here and go to 2020. A formal system of community credits is implemented to acknowledge the contribution made by most people through volunteering. Businesses based on cooperative models begin to outperform traditional models, and products are made for durability with 10-year guarantees for electrical goods becoming the norm. Local food production increases at a rapid rate, and by the end of the decade, imported food is rare. Increase in agriculture, urban allotments and farms change the UK landscape and cityscape, and with green space being utilised for production rather than beauty. As more people spend more time in the local area, local issues shoot up the agenda. During the middle of the decade, more people turn out to vote in local elections than national elections. Politicians run successful campaigns based on zero growth and quality of life. And by the end of the decade, 25% of NHS budgets are spent on prevention and public health, up from 7% in the 2010s. So that's one scenario that could happen. You can see relevance in relation to some of the things that we're currently doing. Now I want to describe another scenario, which is called technology and choice. So this is another perspective on how the future may look. And this is based around a high-tech, low-carbon transformation in delivering dramatic cuts in generous greenhouse emissions while sustaining economic growth. There is competition for low-carbon industry and green enterprise, and those councils that have invested early are reaping the benefits. The public are expected tailored services and numerous lifestyle choices. Local government takes a light touch, low intervention approach, focusing on energy, on providing a framework of coordinating function for local businesses and activity levels of growth. And that masks growing divide between rich and poor people despite progress, and many are questioning the stability of economic growth. Those citizens that do not understand or cannot afford new technology are left behind. So how do we get to that position? So again, I'll sort of talk you through the changes that affected that scenario. So in the first 10 years, a new international agreement on tackling climate change is signed by all major economies, including the US, UK, China and India in 2013. Market forces are identified as the primary needs of moving activities towards a low-carbon economy, and growth becomes increasingly carbon-proof. Rapid technologies and advancements in renewable energy generation, such as hyper-efficient protovoltaics, allow for less reliance on fossil fuels. Sorry, I need a drink. As carbon emissions become more regulated, UK citizens reject flying in favour of high-speed trains and hyper-fast boats. Battery-powered cars become more affordable, and by the end of the decade, more than 50% of UK cars are electric. Access to broadband is declared a basic right, and to the most remote parts of the UK are linked up by the web. Up to 2020, global greenhouse gas emissions flatline. So it's interesting, I think in the reception, I was talking to Jim about electric cars and how that can be moved forward. Clearly in this scenario, things are really progressing. So if we move on to the next 10 years, governments and citizens are increasingly reliant on technology from everything from agriculture to policy making. Large geoengineering projects are at home and abroad help to reduce carbon emissions and physically remove carbon dioxide from the air. A growing number of renewable energy projects and energy efficiency drive for buildings in the UK mean that the majority of energy is provided domestically. However, the remaining energy, mainly in liquid natural gas form, is still imported, often from unstable parts of the world, and that sounds familiar. Towards the middle of the decade, a 2-year global economic recession hits high carbon industries hard in the UK, causing several larger companies to go bust and lay off thousands of workers. Mass migration of people fleeing the impacts of climate change means that the demand for housing hits an all-time high, and tented slum camps appear on the South Downs. Can you imagine that? To meet the need for more housing, previously protected green land is built on, which irrevocably damages UK biodiversity. Native species such as the great yellow bumblebee dwindle and disappear, and the need for increased resources has led Britain to look further afield, and by the middle of the decade, proposals are tabled at the UN to mine Antarctica for precious resources. So that's another scenario, and I think this is another picture coming up. No, that's technology and choice coming up. That's one I've just done, isn't it? Sorry, move on. Yes, another picture. This one is quite a hard one, but it is in the UK, so I'll help you on that. The third scenario then is called emergency state control. And again, this is another scenario that considers a number of changes that have progressed over a period of time. So the key principles here are the state has replaced the markets as the driver of change, and countries around the world have moved swiftly to avoid catastrophic climate change. Economies have been forcibly reorientated to focus on dealing with climate change in much the same way as sometimes happens in times of war. Greenhouse gases have begun to decline, but the cost to the individual liberty has become great. There's been a huge growth in the size of the state, and public services are now focused on absolute necessity. Despite some resistance to change intervention, there is a strong sense of national pride. The majority of people make do and mend, and entrepreneurial activity flourishes as people live with less. However, as more money is spent on monitoring and enforcement, so there is less available to provide a safety net. So I think I'm just sort of conscious of the time, and rather than sort of go through the sequence of scenarios, I'll just use that as it is at the moment, and perhaps move on to the next scenario, which again looks at other changes and how they've impacted on society over that 20-year period. And this one's called Business Revolution. So in this scenario, a high price of carbon has ushered in a revolution on how people's needs are satisfied. Companies have rewritten their business models to meet underlying needs, often by selling services instead of products. The public sector is a low-carbon facilitator involving everything from monitoring carbon budgets and collecting fines to encouraging low-carbon enterprise. With carbon efficiency replacing the cost of efficiency as the mantra of business and government alike, companies and the public services are localised where possible, working closely with newly empowered communities. The proportion of those described as fuel poor has grown, and those that cannot access low-carbon services are excluded. So those are four very interesting and thought-provoking scenarios. And I think it's really important that we need to think about the future in shaping the present and how we move forward. And it's unlikely that the future will mirror any of those exactly, but certainly elements of those could well be the case. And some of the evidence for that, we can already see. So sort of my message to you tonight is, I guess, in the current economic climate, that we should never waste a good crisis, and we need to think about how we move forward. So these are some of the outcomes of that study that we felt were important in terms of our role as champions in local government. And these were about to reorientate the business model for a low-carbon society within local government. Things like really tackling congestion in a more radical way. And it's interesting in Nottingham, where not university popular, you've got workplace charging, but that is one of a way of actually tackling in a fiscal way congestion on the road network. But clearly, if those unpopular things are going to be put forward, there's got to be alternatives to try and compensate. And the key there is to have, which you have in Nottingham, which is very good public transport. Invest in low carbon infrastructure, and I mentioned about shaping new developments. It's really important that we take the opportunity with new infrastructure, that we future-proof those developments, to think about developing them in a more sustainable way in every aspect of how those communities are constructed. With the increasing consequences of climate change through severe weather events, building resilience is increasingly important. And as I said to you earlier in my role about salt shortages, that was a wake-up call for our industry, that we didn't have resilience in tackling winter maintenance, and we've now invested in more resilience in terms of salt supply, salt management and salt storage, and that's just one example. And the important thing about low carbon is in the way we go about, if it's affecting travel, that we don't produce things like social exclusion. And I alluded to one example in one of those scenarios about universal broadband. One of the things you can do in avoiding people having to travel in the first place to acquire services is the ability for them to do that through broadband, but also in terms of health, for example. Can you take the services to the community rather than people having to travel into big hospitals like we're in today, for example. And obviously it's really important that we support the green economy and the investment in low carbon innovation. I like this slide. I included this one because this was my inspiration for the guided busway in Cambridgeshire, but this clearly isn't Cambridgeshire. I wonder if you know where it is. So how is the County Council tackling climate change? So we're very much sort of thinking about all those things I've just said. We produced a sustainable community strategy. We're looking at a carbon management programme, and we had quite an ambitious perspective where we wanted to be the best performing councils in environment by 2012, and that's quite worrying because it's only next year. So how are we going about that? Well, very much putting our own house in order, looking at how we can influence community, but clearly by leadership. And what we've done is an assessment of our own carbon emissions for the county council. And as we're responsible for schools, it's not surprising that that's where most carbon is generated in Leicestershire. But clearly we have our own businesses and our own fleet, all of which we're tackling carbon issues. And what we've set out is a plan to reduce carbon over the next 4 years. But the other benefit is by reducing carbon, it's reducing energy and it's saving money. So the target saving over the next 4 years is going to bring significant help within our current economic climate. Within accommodation, we're rationalising our office space, we're refurbishing our county hall, we're looking at more efficient lighting that is activated by movement rather than people switching the lights on and leaving them on. We're trying to make better use of workspace, and in doing all that we're estimating carbon emission reductions between 1,000 and 1,500 tonnes per annum. Clearly there's cultural issues here about engaging with staff and getting them on board, not just within the workplace but at home as well. So we set up an infrastructure of Go Green champions. I mean, it would be really good in an organisation like this here that you could do something similar. And it can be quite tokenistic things, but when they're aggregated and done together, they can make a real difference. Just thinking about, are you putting your cups in disposable receptacles to make sure they're recycled, for example. But also things like bits of kit that you can put around computers. So if you do leave your computer on at the end of the day, you've got devices that automatically switch it off and don't leave things running through the night. And all the things we're doing there, again, are reducing our carbon emissions by 4,000 or 5,000 tonnes per annum. Quite controversial, but in Leicestershire, not too much of a problem. We're systematically part night lighting, dimming and switching street lights off. And I don't know how you feel, but every time I sort of have the opportunity to go off from East Midlands Airport, you look down on the UK and it's all lit up at night, even though it's 3 a.m. in the morning, and you question, why are all those lights on? So the principle here is that we will still provide street lighting, but it will go off at midnight and come on again when needed, rather than have it on through the night. Looking at devices around voltage optimization, looking at smart metering, and also something that we've just installed. I suppose we're a bit slow off the mark on this, but I've got a meeting in Market Harbour next week, and we've now just recently installed video conferencing, so rather than travelling down there, I'll be able to do it by video conferencing. We're also trying to support community by offering grants around, particularly around parishes, to how we can support their initiatives around the green agenda as well. And also looking at our influence in the economy in terms of supporting lower carbon, because there is potentially a lot of employment around this agenda for the future in terms of goods and services. So, we can influence that in terms of the products we procure, but also how we can support economic development. So, I've sort of divulged lots of information here and rattled through it all. Hopefully there's sort of nuggets in there that of interest you or not. My message again tonight is, never waste a good crisis. The impact of the economic deficit provides us with an opportunity to radically reconsider how we, certainly from myself and the public sector, deliver services. And the coalition government have got new agendas, all of which can help us to rethink about how we do things. And the evidence of increasing the impact of climate change is indisputable, so we cannot carry on ignoring that. And the challenge for you, I suppose, is what action are you going to take, either personally or as a community leader, to make a difference? One more picture for you in the quiz, and I've finished. Thank you.